Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Anne Marie, and today I'm going to discuss the 10 Things I Love About You, Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn. This is a no spoilers book review, so don't worry about me revealing any plot twists or ruining any surprise endings. The whole point of this is to give you an inside peek into the book. Before we delve into the book, however, I think it's important to explain that a psychological thriller is a subgenre of thriller that emphasizes the psychology and mental states of its characters, who are often unstable and battling inner demons. Substance abuse, mental illness, multiple realities, and unreliable narrators are common themes. When it comes to crafting plots and characters in the psychological thriller genre with a whodunit at its core, I don't think anybody does it as beautifully or as masterfully as Gillian Flynn. Sharp Objects is dark and disturbing in many different ways, and when I sat down to make my list of 10 things I love about this book, I first went strictly on memory. Sharp Objects was published in 2006, and having read it many years ago, I asked myself, what do I remember specifically about it? And I challenged myself to come up with 10 things before rereading it. Of course, I tweaked the list after rereading the book, but for the most part, I stuck with my original list. My thinking was that if I remember certain things after all these years, then other readers probably remember them as well. The interesting thing is that most of the items on my list aren't characters or settings, but rather moments in the book that I remember well because they shocked me. Poignant jolts of crudeness is what I've decided to call them. For me, Gillian Flynn is the type of author whose words make me stop and think, you can't write things like that in a book. Oh wait, yes you can. Gillian Flynn just did it. Which is why it's difficult to do justice when explaining one of her novels, because it's not what she writes, it's how she writes it. In a nutshell, Sharp Objects is about Chicago reporter Camille Preaker, who returns to her hometown of Wind Gap, Missouri, to cover the murders of 2 young girls. One is 10, the other is 9. So right off the bat, it's disturbing. While in Wind Gap, Camille decides to stay at her mother's Victorian mansion, where her mother, stepfather, and half-sister live. While battling psychological demons of her own, brought to the forefront now that she's back in the small town where she grew up, Camille attempts to get the story as quickly as possible and get out of there, because at this point in her life, she feels safer and more comfortable in Chicago. The first thing I love about this book is that it's written in first person. I love the first person point of view, especially when the entire story is told from one character's viewpoint, because I feel it offers an intimate relationship between the reader and the narrator by immediately putting the reader inside the mind of the narrator. In this case, the story is told solely from the perspective of Camille Preaker, the novel's narrator and protagonist. And I assure you, Camille's mind is, well, thrilling in a dark and disturbing way, as it should be, because again, this is a psychological thriller. Which brings me to the second thing I love about this book, one of those poignant jolts of crudeness that I mentioned earlier, Camille's description of her boss's office. The first time I read this, I stopped and thought, oh, okay, that's different. Then I laughed and read it again because I thought it was funny. This is how Camille Preaker describes Frank Curry's office. This is from chapter 1. I walked in and shut the door to his office, which isn't how I ever imagined my editor's office would look. I craved big oak panels, a window pane in the door marked Chief, so the cub reporters could watch us rage over First Amendment rights. Curry's office is bland and institutional, like the rest of the building. You could debate journalism or get a pap smear. No one cared. Number 3 on my list is Frank Curry, Camille's boss, who serves not only as her boss, but also as a friend and somewhat of a father figure to Camille. Frank Curry sends her on assignment to Wind Gap, Missouri, to get the story about what is going on with these young girls in that town. And while she's in Wind Gap, she reports back to Frank and occasionally speaks on the phone with his wife, Eileen. Frank and Eileen are my favorite characters in the story because they are like 2 beacons of light in this sea of darkness. For example, in chapter 13, Camille, who isn't feeling well, locks herself inside her bedroom at her mother's house, and thinks about her boss and his wife rescuing her. I had a flash of Curry, one of his crappy ties swinging wildly over his belly, busting into the room to save me, carrying me off in his smoky Ford Taurus, Eileen stroking my hair on the way back to Chicago. So she's envisioning them as the heroes who are going to swoop in and save her from the evilness in Wind Gap. We also learn in Chapter 4 that Frank visited Camille when she was in a psychiatric hospital. I'm going to stop here and admit that the first time I read this book, I had no idea why Camille was in a psychiatric hospital. I didn't do any research prior to reading it. I just started reading. And I was hooked after page 1. So I kept going without any idea of what I was getting myself into. It wasn't until Camille flat out admitted her problem that I was like, oh, hello, now it all makes sense. She hints at it several times, but I didn't understand what she was talking about until I realized what she had done and why she sought psychiatric help. Slightly more crude than the pap smear reference I mentioned earlier, number 4 on the list occurs once Camille is on the road heading to Wind Gap, Missouri. She stops for the night at a motel. After explaining how she prefers baths to showers, she describes the scene in the following way. I wadded a flimsy motel towel over the grate in the shower floor, aimed the nozzle at the wall, and sat in 3 inches of water that pooled in the stall. Someone else's pubic hair floated by. The 5th thing I love about Sharp Objects is Camille's description of her stepfather, Alan. She describes her mother first for a bit of contrast, but this is how it reads. You'd think a lovely thing like my mother was born to be with a big ex-football star. She would have looked just right with a burly, mustached giant. Alan was, if anything, thinner than my mother, with cheekbones that jutted out of his face so high and sharp, his eyes turned to almond slivers. I wanted to administer an IV when I saw him. He overdressed always, even for an evening of sweet drinks with my mother. Now he sat, needly legs jutting out of white safari shorts, with a baby blue sweater draped over a crisp Oxford. He sweated not at all. Alan is the opposite of moist. As for Camille's mother, well, shortly after the description of Alan, we learn this about her mother, which is number 6 on my list, because I think it's very strange. And again, it's one of those details that I didn't forget. Even years after reading this book, I still remembered this. When my mother is piqued, she has a particular tell. She pulls at her eyelashes. Sometimes they come out. During some particularly difficult years, when I was a child, she had no lashes at all, and her eyes were a constant gluey pink, vulnerable as a lab rabbit's. In wintertime, they leaked streaks of tears whenever she went outdoors, which wasn't often. To say this family is bizarre is a bit of an understatement, but I'll let you make your own decision on that. The 7th thing I love about Sharp Objects is Camille's description of her mother's Victorian house. This is found in Chapter 2. My mother's massive house is at the southernmost point of Wind Gap, the wealthy section, if you count approximately 3 square blocks of town as a section. She lives in, and I once did too, an elaborate Victorian replete with a widow's walk, a wraparound veranda, a summer porch jutting toward the back, and a cupola arrowing out of the top. It's full of cubby holes and nooks, curiously circuitous. The Victorians, especially Southern Victorians, needed a lot of room to stray away from each other, to duck tuberculosis and flu, to avoid rapacious lust, to wall themselves away from sticky emotions. Extra space is always good. The house is at the very top of a very steep hill. In first gear, you can drive up the cracked old driveway to the top, where a carriage porch keeps cars from getting wet. Or you can park at the bottom of the hill and walk the 63 stairs to the top, clutching the cigar-thin rail to the left. Number 8 on my list are Camille's dreams. She has them throughout the book, and some prove prophetic, which is why this book is sometimes categorized as a psychic mystery. This is the dream she has in chapter 10 after drinking amaretto sours with her mother. I drank the rest of the sours and had dark, sticky dreams. My mother had cut me open and was unpacking my organs, stacking them in a row on my bed as my flesh flapped to either side. She was sewing her initials into each of them, then tossing them back into me, along with a passel of forgotten objects. An orange Day-Glo rubber ball I got from a gumball machine when I was 10. A pair of violet wool stockings I wore when I was 12. A cheap gold-tinted ring a boy bought me when I was a freshman. With each object, relief that it was no longer lost. When I woke, it was past noon, and I was disoriented and afraid. I took a gulp from my flask of vodka to ease the panic, then ran to the bathroom and threw it up, along with strings of sugary brown saliva from the amaretto sours. The ninth thing I love about sharp objects is the repeated use of the color yellow. Most of the things in this book that aren't dark and gray have a sickly yellow tinge to them. Let me give you some examples. This is found in chapter 4. They always call depression the blues, but I would have been happy to waken to a periwinkle outlook. Depression to me is urine yellow, washed out, exhausted miles of weak piss. This example from chapter 10 is one of my favorite lines from the book because I think the imagery here is powerful. Black clouds were sitting low over the town, so the sun curled around the edges and turned everything a sickly yellow, as if we were bugs under fluorescence. And finally, from chapter 15, she had a mustache and yellowed fingertips from smoking, matching the brown canines that peeked out from beneath her upper lip. The face you give the world tells the world how to treat you, my mother used to say whenever I resisted her grooming. This woman could not be treated well. And finally, the 10th thing I love about this book is the review Stephen King wrote for it. To say this is a terrific debut novel is really too mild. I haven't read such a relentlessly creepy family saga since John Ferris's All Heads Turn as the Hunt Goes By. And that was 30 years ago, give or take. Sharp Objects isn't one of those scare and retreat books. Its effect is cumulative. I found myself dreading the last 30 pages or so, but was helpless to stop turning them. Then, after the lights were out, the story just stayed there in my head, coiled and hissing, like a snake in a cave. An admirably nasty piece of work, elevated by sharp writing and sharper insights. Yes, definitely. I totally agree with him. His review is spot on. This book will stay with you for a while. My recommendation is to do something colorful and fun after reading it. Paint an art piece, go for a walk, plant some flowers, whatever the case. You need to give yourself time to process the darkness of the story and then slowly let it go. If you've read Sharp Objects and would like to add to my list of things to love, feel free to do so in the comments. Until next time, take care, be well, and happy reading.